Welcome, everyone. Kevin and Clinton back again, another video. Continuing the Business of Sports series, finishing off our talk on Capology, specifically looking at long-term injury reserve, buyouts. How does all that work? Still with the NHL example. Kevin, I'll let you jump right in here, and I'll pull up a little bit of definition of the long-term injury reserve. And how does that work in the NHL? How does that apply to the cap space? Help us out.
Yeah, we've already done cap, what it is, how it basically works. But one of the main ingredients on how to figure out certain things and why the Toronto Maple Leafs were over last time has to do with long-term injury reserve. And basically what it is if a player is expected to miss at least 10 games in 24 days, he can be put on what's known as LTIR. And of course, we know the NHL, like other sports, always loves acronyms. AAV, LTIR, OT, whatever the case may be.
Not official unless you have an acronym for it.
Exactly. It's not right. So if the player is on LTIR, what basically you can do is you can exceed the salary cap by up to that amount if you're at the full cap level, or that amount minus whatever your free cap space is. So that's why I say a team like Toronto could be at 96 million if they have a lot of LTIR guys and still be at that 83 million cap because these players are on injury reserve. That gives them more ability because at times the NHL, like any other league, feels it's not fair. If you've lost an $8 million player, well, you should be able to replace him with somebody that maybe is decent if you have that on your lineup. So these are things that you have to consider when dealing with the salary cap.
Yeah, and a few extra details here is when the player returns, let's say they're medically cleared, they're healthy again, well, you now have to make room for them in your cap. You have to be cap compliant when that player comes back. LTIR can be used in the offseason as well. You just hinted at that with the Maple Leafs and kind of their situation. But important details there. We're talking long-term injury reserve. We should also mention we're doing this at a high level. There's lots of detail and some complexity when you get into the nitty-gritty here of how this applies. And teams will enlist analysts to go through the nitty-gritty of this to make sure they get maximum value here when they're doing the LTIR and if guys are going on or off and how it impacts their cap space. And that kind of leads us to the next part of this long-term injury reserve conversation. Sometimes teams have been accused of kind of taking advantage of this system in some areas, part of which combines with the fact that when you're in the NHL playoffs, there is no salary cap on the playoffs. So if you had someone on long-term injury reserve and they just happened to be healthy, Kevin, the very first day of the playoffs, well, they can now come back. And since there's no cap in the playoffs, you'd be perfectly fine to do your playoff run with those players, even if you happen to be over the salary cap. A couple of teams have done this. We don't want to just pick on Tampa, but they have probably the most recent example of the abuse of LTIR and how it applies to a playoff run. And they won the cup the year they did this. So that's why we're mentioning that. Why don't you walk us through what happened here?
Yeah, I mean, and that's basically the thing, right? Like the LTIR, they worry about the abuse that can go on with it. And again, when does a medical doctor clear you? Are you good enough to play 3 games before or after? But we won't get into those things. Let's just do this thing. Kucherov, as you mentioned down here, he has a $9.5 million cap hit. And he basically missed the whole season, but he was fine for day 1 of the playoffs and back in. So now they've got their 80 million plus the 9.5 million. And he wasn't the only one. Stamkos was on injury reserve, as was other players. They actually have T-shirts made that said 18 million over the cap. So that was huge. And yes, that does play into it. But again, most of this seemed to start back in 2015. Patrick Kane had that for Chicago. And even last year when Mark Stone all of a sudden in his $9.5 million managed to come back onto Vegas. So it is an interesting area. And I'm sure that there is something they're going to have to deal with sooner or later. But based on the rules, this is the way it works. And with no cap compliancy when it comes to playoffs, you know, LTIR players are huge to add. And if you have somebody going on just before, you can really increase what your team can do with going forward. So
you need the right team doctor there, Kevin. You need the right team doctor. No one gets cleared a week before the playoffs. It's the day the playoffs start where everyone is magically healed.
That's right.
Like no doctor. Yeah, if they want to earn their salary, they're not going to clear anybody a month prior to the playoffs.
No, not at all. So
we love talking about sports. We love talking about Capology, but of course we also do financial planning and personal finance. If you have questions on anything in that range, let us know. You can see Chat with Clinton and Kevin at the bottom of the screen there. Fill in the forum, comes right to us. We'd love to have the conversation. We talked LTIR. We have to go through another kind of big item when it relates to the cap and how it happens in the NHL, and that would have to do with buyouts, right? When a player's near the end of their contract, the Jets just went through this with Blake Wheeler. What is a buyout, Kevin?
Well, basically a buyout is you're paying the person 2/3 of their salary over twice the remaining number of years on it. Now, if it is a player that's 26 and under, you only have to pay 1/3 of that contract value. But hopefully you've got those kind of players going on. Now, before this whole buyout process has to happen, of course, they have to go through what's known as unconditional waivers. If they pass through that, then they can be bought out. And the waiver wire is there because maybe somebody wants to take on the contract. In the case of Blake Wheeler, we didn't see that just based on the fact of how high the contract was and his age. But for an example we've got here, if you got a 27-year-old player making $12 million a year on 2 years left, the buyout, of course, is only 2/3, so 16 mil, and that's paid out as opposed to the 2 years over 4. So that team is going to have a $4 million dead cap space for the next 4 years. That's got to be added in on the whole $83.5 million over the year. So basically, they're working on, $79.5 million for the next 4 years with a buyout of a player that way.
Yeah, and I'll pull up Cap Friendly here, which is a website that has a lot of information, a lot of detail, and you can see we're already on the page for the Winnipeg Jets. I'm scrolling down. You have a recent example here, Kevin, what we just talked about with Blake Wheeler, where his contract was bought out, and you can see the Jets are going to pay him $2,750,000 for this season, and they're also going to pay him for next season as well, because like we talked about, it's twice the remaining years, 2/3 the value. Just went through the formula there, so that will apply for Blake Wheeler. So think about that. He now gets picked up by a different team. He's playing for the Rangers, but the Jets are still paying him almost $3 million for the next 2 years while he plays hockey for a different team. It's a little weird when you think about it, but I understand, right? The team's trying to rebuild. This is one way they can kind of move the contract on with a minimal cap hit, and now they can go acquire other players and hopefully get what they need for their team, right? But that's what this means here. They have dead cap, you have the buyout, and you can see Blake Wheeler listed with that particular space. That happens every year. There's actually a whole season for buyouts, right? There's a deadline where teams have to do this buy. You want to walk us through how that might work?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there's only a few numbers of openings per year that you can buy out. You can buy out right after the draft because maybe there's some players you want to do there. If a player goes through arbitration, then there's another buyout period that's opening up. And again, that's because you don't know what an arbitrated player is going to get in a salary, so you may have to adjust if you want to keep them. But yeah, basically the buyouts, again, it could be players on longer term or they're just not worth the salary. I mean, Blake at $8.25 million a year was fairly expensive. And the Vancouver Canucks, 4 more years of Oliver Ekman-Larsson at $8.5 million. Didn't prove what the Canucks want, so now they're paying a smaller amount, but over 8 years. So for some teams, if you can fit a smaller amount of money in for a year or 2 or 4, then it makes sense just to get rid of a player with a high contract or somebody that's not performing. So those are big ones. But there is a really large example out there, isn't there, Clint, of what the buyout process was. And again, a lot of this stuff started when you just came new into the salary cap before some of the restrictions and things came along. Who would that player be that we want to touch base on?
Yeah, if you've been on the internet at all in the last 5-6 years, specifically in sports, this is a common meme. In fact, they actually have a name for it, Rick DiPietro Day. We call it Canada Day in Canada, but in the U.S., the hockey world calls it Rick DiPietro Day. The story there, he was the goaltender for the New York Islanders. He was actually the second goalie ever to be selected first overall in the draft. He was picked in the year 2000, and then 2006 renegotiated the salary, signed a massive 15-year contract, which just in today's terms seems absurd, but it was worth $67.5 million. Then in 2013, after a string of injuries where he really wasn't playing, the Islanders bought him out. There were 8 years left in his contract at the time, so keep this in mind. It's twice the remaining years. He gets paid for 16 years, and the value was $36 million at the time of the buyout, so he ends up with $1.5 million a year every July 1st, all the way until 2029. So he hasn't played hockey since 2013, and he's been getting $1.5 million a year on July 1st every year to not play hockey. You don't even have to pay me that much to not play hockey, Kevin. I'll do it for far less. If the Islanders are looking for another buyout, they can pay me fractions of that, and I will sit at home. But DiPietro, July 1st every year, all the way until 2029 as a result of his massive buyout of that contract. That's the famous example right there, Rick DiPietro Day.
Yeah, and it's another reason why too many teams don't want to buy out too many players. I mean, the last thing you want to do is have 5 or 6 of those kind of guys in your lineup and all of a sudden realize, you got $10 million a year. I mean, the prime example of that right now would be the Minnesota Wild, who bought out Suter and Parise on their 13-year contracts. And over the last few years, they've been paying $14 million between the two of them a year to keep them away and play for somebody else. That is huge. Now, at the end of the time frame, that's probably great for you, but you struggle in those years where you have to pay those kind of bucks. So buyouts can be interesting. They can leverage some stuff, but by the same token, they can hamper a team going forward. So that sort of covers the buyout thing as a whole, I would say.
Yeah, we'll leave it there for today. Again, Business to Sports, part of a new series that we are going to be doing. Likely have some more videos of this nature in the future. So please take care and watch for those videos.